Okay, let's get right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are taking a completely mesmerizing, step-by-step visual journey. We're going to examine the exact, meticulous process behind building an incredibly intricate portrait, specifically the mighty angel standing on the sea and the land, entirely out of raw organic materials. We are talking about a completely handcrafted, hands-on process of staggering scale that transforms a totally empty white space into an absolute masterpiece. So, to truly understand this process, we first have to ask a seemingly impossible question. How do you create a photorealistic portrait completely from scratch without drawing a single line? I mean, no paint, not a dash of ink, and absolutely no glue. How do you construct something so detailed using only what you might find lying on the forest floor? Well, the answer lies in extreme patience and a set of incredibly rigid constraints that guide every single movement. All right, Section 1, the strict cinematic setup. Let's explore the unbreakable rules of this canvas. The setup here is remarkably disciplined. The camera is basically acting as a strict, unwavering observer. It's locked in a perfectly fixed 90-degree overhead position under bright studio lighting. There are no fancy tricks here. No zooming in, no panning, no perspective shifts, and zero rotation of either the camera or the artwork. The orientation and scale stay exactly the same from the very first frame to the last. What you see is a pure, undistorted canvas. Now, what's really fascinating is the severe limitation on the materials themselves. Every single element used to build this angel must be raw nature. We're talking twigs, tree bark, rough wood fragments, moss, tiny splinters, and pine needles. On the flip side, the bans are absolute. No paint, no ink, no plastic, no metal, and crucially, no synthetic binders or glue. The creator is relying entirely on gravity, friction, and ultra-precise placement. Because of these strict rules, we follow a linear, completely uncompromising timeline. There's a strict continuity rule in place. We transition from a totally empty white void to a skeletal frame, then to dense wood, and finally down to micro details. There's no skipping stages, no jumping forward in time, and definitely no magical teleportation of materials. We witness every single stage of development as it happens. Moving into Section 2, constructing the skeletal outline, going from empty space to a primitive silhouette. It starts so simply. The hands gently place the first few tiny twigs right near the center to establish the central axis. Then they arrange a basic structural framework. Finally, they slowly expand outwards, arranging slightly larger, curved branches to build out a skeletal silhouette of the mighty angel. At this stage, you'll notice large, empty white spaces between the pieces. The artwork is intentionally left incomplete. It's just a whisper of the form that's to come. The absolutely crucial point here is that there's no digital magic happening. Every subtle correction, every single time a twig is nudged just a millimeter to the left or right to fix an alignment, it's the direct result of deliberate, physical human interaction. Human touch is literally the only tool being used. You get to experience this highly satisfying, hyperlapse rhythm of pure physical creation. Section 3, fleshing out the form. This is where we start building density with rough wood and bark. Through this rhythmic progression, the hands methodically start placing larger pieces of rough wood. Hundreds of textured bark fragments are introduced, layered one by one inside that initial twig framework. They work across different sections, building up the broad masses of the subject. But importantly, they preserve the natural gaps. The artwork remains visibly constructed. It doesn't just suddenly become a solid block. You can still clearly see the crisp, macro details of the wood grain and the moss. And this brilliantly illustrates what we call the rough carving stage. Instead of using a tool to carve down a smooth surface, the creator uses the natural curvature of the wood fragments themselves to define the major contours of the angel's body. They aren't trying to hide the cracks, the organic fibers, or the knots in the wood. Actually, those imperfections are utilized as shading and texture. It ends up looking like a highly detailed wooden drawing rather than a polished, smooth sculpture. Okay, Section 4, refining the intricate details. We are transitioning to micromaterials now. The tension really builds at this point. The hands completely abandon the larger branches and thick bark. They switch exclusively to tiny splintered pieces of wood and thin pine needles. They start placing directional natural fibers to slowly build layered textures that mimic hair, fur, and the folds of delicate clothing. The patience required at this stage is truly astounding and honestly kind of intimidating. All of this painstaking work leads to the most highly anticipated stage, constructing the face.
They don't just drop a finished face into the composition. Instead, they use miniature splinters to construct the broad facial planes first. Then, they slowly tease the features out of the rough wood: the forehead, the cheeks, the jawline. Finally, using the absolute sharpest, tiniest twigs and pine needles, they construct the eyes and those sharp facial lines.
It is an absolute wonder to behold because the physical reality of the construction is the star of the show here. The eyes and those sharp expressions emerge strictly through the gradual accumulation of matter. There's no sudden morphing or dissolving. The face doesn't just magically appear, it's physically built millimeter by millimeter right before your eyes. The illusion of continuous physical construction is never once broken.
Finally, Section 5, the final artwork revealed, the satisfying culmination of micro-textures. At this final stage, the pace intentionally slows down. The hands are just making tiny, deliberate adjustments. They delicately add the final miniature fibers and tiny bark fragments into any remaining gaps. They inspect the entire piece for tactile, natural irregularities to ensure it feels authentically organic. Only then, after the entire exhaustive process is complete, do the hands slowly withdraw from the frame, leaving behind a stunningly intricate, photorealistic natural materials drawing that relies completely on tactile macro detail.
You know, this quote perfectly embodies the core philosophy of the entire endeavor. Every visible improvement must happen through the physical placement of individual natural pieces by the human hands. This strict discipline is exactly what gives the final, completely flat, totally stationary piece its immense power. It proves that raw patience, rigid boundaries, and simple organic matter can create something utterly mesmerizing.
As we take in the completed portrait of the mighty angel under those bright studio lights, it leaves us with a pretty powerful reflection. Knowing that every single fiber was deliberately, physically placed, how might this kind of radical, meticulous constraint change the way you approach your own creative challenges? Could you summon the patience to build your own masterpiece, step by step, one tiny splinter at a time? It's definitely a fascinating concept to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.